Russia and China pledge to strengthen their relations. President Xi Jinping has met the Russian Prime Minister and called for more cooperation to deal with what he called a turbulent external environment. Can the traditional allies weather the challenges posed by the US and other Western nations? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. China has been Russia's largest trading partner for 15 consecutive years. Bilateral trade between the two countries touched nearly $245 billion in 2024, rising 1.9% year on year. But commerce between the two has taken a hit in recent months, following pressure exerted by Donald Trump. The US president has been imposing sanctions and secondary tariffs on Moscow and its business partners in what he says is an attempt to end the war in Ukraine. Russia and China are now pledging a joint response against what they call unilateral sanctions. Can this succeed, and how would it impact the so-called trade truce between the US and China agreed last week by Presidents Trump and Xi Jinping? We'll unpack these issues with our guests shortly, but first, Dmitry Medvedenko sets the scene with this report.
A visit by Russia's Prime Minister to China comes as tensions are growing with the US. It's intended as a show of friendship as the Trump administration pressures countries against making deals with Moscow and restricting those with Beijing, something the Chinese president has called a turbulent external environment.
The high level of strategic trust and the close contact between the heads of state are the key guarantees for the stable and sustainable development of the comprehensive strategic partnership between our two countries.
It's important to continue creating favourable conditions for attracting mutual investment and supporting our joint projects. We value our strong cultural and humanitarian ties.
China is one of Russia's few allies, following its invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Beijing is an important buyer of Russian oil, something the West has criticized, saying it's helping fund Russia's war in Ukraine. Recent sanctions targeting Russian oil giants Lukoil and Rosneft have hit those exports hard and are limiting supplies to some Chinese refineries.
On the Ukraine crisis, China has persistently committed to promoting peace and facilitating talks. Normal exchanges and cooperation between Chinese and Russian enterprises should not be disrupted or affected. China will take necessary measures to resolutely safeguard its legitimate rights and interests.
Major Chinese oil companies like Sinopec are reported to have stopped buying Russian oil. But Yulong, a Chinese refiner sanctioned by the West, has increased its supplies from Russia, according to media reports. As some of the world's largest hydrocarbons producers and consumers, Moscow and Beijing are seeking to weather Western sanctions. And with this meeting in China, both are hoping they'll find new ways to promote their economic synergy. Dmitry Medvedenko, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
OK, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Richard Weitz, a senior non-resident associate fellow at the NATO Defense College. In Beijing is Einar Tangen. He's a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And in Moscow is Andrey Kortunov. He's a former Director General of Russian International Affairs Council. A welcome to you all. I'll start with you first, if I may, Richard. Are Russia and China equal partners in this relationship?
No, I don't think you would call them equal partners. I think that Russia has certain advantages, particularly in the strength of its nuclear forces, the experience of its military, and its pivotal location in the heart of Eurasia. But China is generally considered the dominant partner, and we project that will increase over time because China's economy is just much larger than that of Russia. Its military is growing faster than any other country, any other large country at least, and particularly its nuclear forces will at some point probably equal those of the United States of Russia. And China has a much larger population, has better relations with a larger number of countries, has more influence in Europe and so on. So certainly Russia is a very important and powerful country, but most people here think China will surpass Russia over time, and that disparity will increase.
Einar, it is an asymmetrical relationship, isn't it? And as Richard suggests there, it's only going to get more one-sided as China grows.
Bernard, I think the problem here is that we tend to think of the past as the future. For 600 years, it's always been about dominant powers. It's about who's on top, king of the hill. China has displayed, and I think they followed through for the last 12 years with Belt and Road initiatives and all the other things that they have done, that it's not about domination, it's about cooperation. Domination is about a zero-sum game, this idea that what I take, you can't have. So China believes that you can make the pie bigger. It's certainly done so in China. They started off with very little, and look where they've gone now. And they believe that that's the blueprint for the future. So when you hear Washington kind of portraying this as asymmetrical, this really speaks to how Washington thinks about things. It's either we're on top or you're on the bottom. So at this point, I would say that these are two countries that have a very good symmetry in the sense that one is the largest resource country in the world, and it's anxious to start building up. It was denied a place in the international order by the United States, in its opinion, pushing beyond these demarcated areas that, Howard Baker said we will never go 1 inch into. And China has sympathy for that. And then you have the world's largest manufacturer, who the UNDP said will be 45% of the world's manufacturing by 2030, whereas the U.S. will shrink down to 11%. This does not mean domination. It means cooperation. China is vulnerable because they need markets. They need to build up Russia, not drag it down. This isn't the U.S.
Well, Andrey, it sounds like it's only good news from the Beijing perspective there as far as Moscow's concerned. Does Moscow view this as a relationship of equals? It would like to view it like that, wouldn't it? But China is the dominant force here.
Well, I think that it really depends on a particular sector that we discuss. For instance, if you look at the Russian car market, today it is clearly dominated by China manufacturers. And many Russian consumers would like to see more competition in this market. They would like to see Japanese or South Korean or European car makers to get back to Russia. However, if you take some other areas, these domination of China is much less visible, and definitely both sides are doing their best to make sure that this relationship looks as a relationship of equal partners. They can agree on certain issues, but they can disagree on certain issues. China cannot really impose its will on Russia. For instance, China and Russia have very different perspectives on India, and Beijing has to live with that, though maybe at some points Beijing is not very happy about Moscow being engaged, especially in military and technical cooperation with New Delhi.
All right. Well, Richard, help us understand then, what is it that is binding Russia and China together? What are their mutual interests?
Well, I think there are a number of them, and they've grown over time. First, they share a very long border. In the past, they've fought over that, including militarily, but also contested territorial claims. They put those aside for now and seem to want to promote cooperation, particularly in the economic sphere and tourism along that border. They share regional interests. For example, your program has discussed the Russia-China connections with North Korea. They also have important ties with Central Asia and less important but still overlapping interests in other parts of the world, particularly Africa and Middle East and in Europe. Economically, there are some natural partnerships. China is one of the leading importers of foreign energy, and Russia has that in abundance. Russia doesn't have easy access to Western technology, so they'll often turn to China for high-tech goods. And admittedly, one of the factors binding them together is opposition to the United States.
All right. Well, Einar, is that the primary thing that binds them together, the opposition to the United States or a counter to US influence, or is it much more? Is it much more about trade and general improving of cooperation between the two countries?
Well, they can both be true, right? It's the United States who's been the aggressor in the minds of both Russia and China. Russia in terms of encroachment into security areas, China in encroachment into security areas like Taiwan, and also economically through these tariffs. Yes, they are banding together, but the fact is, as I said before, number one resource country, right? Number one manufacturing company, and they share a border that the United States cannot interfere with. We're already seeing the U.S. saying they don't like BRICS, and they certainly don't like China's Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, they don't like anything that China is doing. And this is the aggressive part of, the United States. It believes it can forestall a multipolar world and reassert unipolar dominance over the world, and that's gone. Now, going back to something you said, oh, everything's rosy. That's not true. There are lots of points where Russia and China have to work things out. Andrey pointed to some of them. This issue of historic regional influence, very important. Yeah. But I think China has handled these things. They understand that these are pressure points. So what they're doing is they have the SCO. What is that about? It's not a defensive alliance. What it is about maintaining internal security for countries that are there. It is talking about how we can share technology with other countries. It is not a country that is saying, we will make stuff and we will extract value from it. And that is the big difference, and why you have to think of today's world as opposed to yesterday's.
All right. Well, Andrey, Einar mentioned there the SCO. Is it that China and Russia are sort of comrades in arms against American dominance? Have they been coordinating policy since the start of Trump's second term?
Well, if you take specifically the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, initially it was a grouping of countries with the intention to fight against extremism, terrorism, and separatism. It was not about the United States or even about the West at large. But of course, right now, 20 years later, we see that SCO has become an important regional body, which is at least implicitly anti-Western, or at least non-Western. And definitely they believe that they can promote regional cooperation, both in development and in security. And the assumption is that they can handle their affairs without the West being involved. For instance, SCO right now is very keen on the problems of Afghanistan, and definitely the Indian-Pakistan dimension is also very important in terms of security of the region. So the assumption that SCO might evolve as a kind of natural integration mechanism that would bring the countries of the region together without necessarily challenging the influences from the outside.
Richard, is the SCO and also the BRICS grouping, Brazil, Russia, India and China, are those bodies having an effect on sort of decreasing US influence as far as China and Russia might see? Global influence?
Right. I would say no, because they're more a product of some of the broader trends we're discussing than a cause. That is, the U.S. and its partners have seen a declining share of the global economy, declining influence in the international information sphere, and so on. And those are reflected in the construction of alternative networks, alternative structures, often led by Russia and China. So I wouldn't say that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS group itself is challenging, is leading these changes. I think this is just more manifestation of how these changes are showing themselves in these alternative structures.
Okay. Einar, particularly European critics of the relationship between China and Russia might say that China is propping up Russia's war machine against Ukraine because, of course, China is buying a lot of oil and other goods, mainly energy goods, from Russia. How much leverage does China have over Russia now on that?
None. I mean, quite frankly, Xi Jinping isn't going to start calling up Putin and saying, this is the way you should run your country.
No.
On one hand, China is very, very clear that they were not happy about what happened in Ukraine. It is happening in Ukraine. They have a principle of non-interference. The SCO is all about guaranteeing the territorial integrity of countries. On the other hand, beginning in 2014 with the putsch against an elected official who was pro-Russian, that was supported by Europe and the U.S., and then later, when they were trying to make peace, both Merkel and Hollande admitted that they had no intention of following along with it. So, you can't, the Europeans are very holier than thou. I talked to many of the representatives here, and they're always saying the same thing. You have to tell China to get on our side. And I said, well, what side is that? Which side are you on? You've admitted bad faith. You were involved in this putsch. Why do you think that Russia would stand still when they see you going in for their security? So this is why China has a very set policy. They do not supply arms. They do buy oil. They trade with Russia, and they're going to continue to trade with Russia. But this equating somehow that there's a moral imperative by Europe of all areas, a colonial power that's just, coming to terms with the fact of the horrific things that it did in its colonial empires, a little bit rich.
All right. Andrey, does Moscow worry about its reliance on China, particularly when we're talking about purchases of oil, when we're talking about military cooperation?
Well, I think that there are concerns that China might yield under the U.S. pressure and might limit the purchases of Russia's oil and gas. However, I think that most people here in Moscow do not believe that this is likely to happen because the perception is that, first of all, Russian hydrocarbons are much cheaper than what China can buy from the United States. Second, the Trump administration is not necessarily reliable. They can make a deal with China and then they might change their minds. And of course, on energy, this is not a very good situation for a large consumer of imported oil and gas. And in terms of I think, a more general relationship between Russia and China in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, I think in Moscow they understand that Beijing is trying to stay outside of this conflict. It doesn't want to support Moscow directly. But if we are talking about a broader confrontation between Russia and NATO, definitely China tilts towards Russia because NATO is a challenge not only to Russia's security, but with its plans to globalize, it might be also perceived as a potential challenge to China as well. So in this broader sense, China is naturally closer to Moscow than it is to Brussels or to Washington, D.C.
All right. Well, so Richard, just to expand a little bit on what Andrey was saying there, how significant an impact does China's support for Russia have on Europe and the US's attempts to sort of pressurize Russia, particularly over Ukraine?
Well, President Trump made this an important agenda item of his recent discussions with President Xi in South Korea. From the U.S. point of view, Chinese support for Russia's war machine, particularly the military operations in Ukraine, is very important. It's not, China is not providing weapons, but it's providing most everything short of that. So by buying Russian oil, by filling the gap from withdrawal of Western companies, by providing high-tech and dual-use goods that have primarily civilian and commercial application, but that can be used militarily. That's, in our view, in the consensus U.S. view, is leading to the war, to increasing Russian military power and leading the war to last longer than it could. That said, I do agree that if President Xi were to call up President Putin tomorrow and say, you got to end this war, President Putin wouldn't do that. I think he's just fully invested in this war. And it's hard for me to see anything that's going to make him change his view.
I mean, Einar, the Russians and Chinese have spoken of this no limits partnership, haven't they? But there's a limit to what China would do. It's not going to do anything that would commit anything to Russia that would lead to open conflict with the West, is it, or to the risk of sanctions?
Well, Bar, the issue here is China's very well aware of history and actually reads it and believes it. It does not want a repeat of World War I, where you had all these interlocking alliances, which actually triggered the war as opposed to preventing it, as many of the people at the time thought. So right now, China is trying to be peaceful. It's trying to promote the Belt and Road Initiative. It is not supplying bombs and weapons that are being used in the genocide in Gaza. I always get a kick out of the fact when I meet fellow Americans who start talking piously about China supplying dual-use items to Russia and oil. Well, Russia may be seen as the bad guy, but they're not committing a genocide actively, and and China certainly isn't supporting one. So I find this repugnant, that the idea that a country that is engaged in supporting an active genocide is out there proselytizing about what other countries should be or should not be doing.
All right. Andrey, is Russia aware of the limits of the relationship with Beijing and what Beijing would do for Russia?
Well, I think that there is an understanding that there are certain things that Beijing is not likely to do, and that definitely Beijing will act in its own interests. The point is that these interests often coincide with that of the Russian Federation. But I think that after a couple of years, both sides realize that the partner has its own limitations, and this limitation will be there to stay. I think that they are more or less happy with what they have right now. I don't expect any push for a closer military or political cooperation. I don't think that Russia and China are likely to form an alliance with very rigid commitments. I think flexibility is something that both sides value, and I think they will try to preserve the relationship mostly as it is right now.
Richard, if the US wants to, can it pull China and Russia apart from each other? Trump obviously vacillates on friendly or warnings to Vladimir Putin particularly. What can the US do if it wanted to?
Right. That is an excellent question that has been a focus of U.S. study for the past decade. There have been many people have pondered this issue. And unfortunately, it doesn't look to be the case in the sense that at times, President Obama tried to pull China away from Russia. President Trump at various points has tried to pull Russia away from China. The problem is there's nothing that the U.S. can credibly offer either country that would cause them to switch sides the way that Kissinger was able to pull China into the U.S. side against the Soviet Union in the 1970s. That is, I suppose if the U.S. were to allow Russia to control Ukraine totally, dismantle NATO, and so on, that might, over time, lead Russia to move closer to the West. But those are considered to be the cure is worse than the disease. It would just be considered to be too much of a risk and too damaging. Same in Asia. I suppose if the U.S. were to allow the mainland to occupy Taiwan, to withdraw its military bases from Japan and South Korea, that might over time pull China closer to the U.S. But I just, and that's something that's also considered to be too dangerous, too detrimental to U.S. values and interests. So it seems to me this alignment is going to continue. It will perhaps fluctuate a bit over time. I think that it may be opportunities to pull Russia or China apart, in the sense at least move them closer to the U.S. after President Putin or President Xi leaves office. But I think those two leaders are fully committed to their partnership and won't really do anything to disrupt that.
Okay, and Einar, I suppose you might say it's not a matter of the US pulling China away from Russia, but being China having a foot in all camps.
No, it's not. It's not trying to put any foot in anybody's camp. That's the whole point. I always love when people say Kissinger did all this stuff. Kissinger was as surprised as anybody when he's contacted by Zhou Enlai to start this. But you always see yourself as the hero of your history. But the fact is, they want to pull China and Russia apart. I don't think so. Giving China something which it believes it already has, Taiwan, is not going to do it. The key here is a change in attitude in Washington. Once Washington realizes it is not the ruler of the world, it doesn't set the guardrails and all this kind of nonsense, and gets rid of people like Donald Trump, that, then they can come to the terms where they live in a multipolar world. They're a powerful nation that can help and be part of the world, but they're not going to stand alone. Now, in terms of people dying, don't count it. Not with Xi. Xi Jinping is not the whole government. And this idea that he controls it is a myth that's perpetuated by the U.S. intelligence agencies. It's a 92 million member party, and they push along as they see fit.
All right, and quickly, just lastly also then, from you, Andrey, can the US do anything to increase its influence with Russia? It's not succeeded so far in persuading Vladimir Putin to end the war in Ukraine.
Well, I think that there are still conflicts between Washington and Moscow, and I hope that there'll be some progress before too long. At least it seems that Russia is ready to work with the United States more than it is ready to work with Europe or with anyone else on this issue. So let us stay optimistic, though, of course, the challenges are still quite significant, and we cannot take for granted that this conflict will end very, very soon.
Okay, thanks to all our guests, to Richard Weitz, to Einar Tangen, and to Andrey Kortunov. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here, bye for now.